All right, good afternoon and welcome to this COMPAS webinar on markets in the workplace. I'm Eric MacGilvray. I'm a professor in the political science department here at Ohio State, and I'm the coordinator of this year's COMPAS series on markets in the open society. I'll also be moderating today's session. As many of you know, COMPAS is a program of the Ohio State Center for Ethics and Human Values. COMPAS is an acronym that stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And the mission of the COMPAS program is to promote informed and civil discussion of important and controversial public issues. Obviously, the question of whether markets promote or hinder the aims of an open society is one of the most important and contested public issues of our time. We've lined up an exciting series of events this year to discuss the many various dimensions of that topic. Details about future events, as well as recordings of past events, can be found at cehv.osu.edu/compass, and that's compass with one S. It's an acronym. Today's webinar will focus on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, the relationship between markets and freedom. We're all familiar with the claim that markets and freedom go hand in hand, that markets make possible a decentralized, uncoordinated, and non-coercive social order, and that the emergence and spread of market economies has given rise to a level of prosperity unprecedented in human history, and that's vastly increased the effective ability of human beings to do what they want. We're also familiar with the claim that markets have generated unprecedented levels of material inequality, vastly increased the amount of vulnerability that many people experience, and reduced the wide range of human goods and values down to the single dimension of price or profit, all things that have been described and experienced as involving a loss of freedom. That's the terrain that today's conversation is going to explore, and I'm delighted that we have two distinguished guests to explore it with us. Let me briefly introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. Matt Zwolinski is professor of philosophy at the University of San Diego, where he directs the Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy and the undergraduate program in philosophy, politics, and economics. As those titles suggest, his research interests lie at the intersection of ethics, law, and economics, with special emphasis on the basic income guarantee, the nature of exploitation, and the history of libertarian ideas. He's the author of numerous articles and the co-author or co-editor of several forthcoming books. Felicia Wong is president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, a leading progressive think tank. Her research focuses on post-neoliberal thought and the intersection of race, economics, and social stratification. She's the author of The Emerging Worldview, How New Progressivism is Moving Beyond Neoliberalism, and co-author of The Hidden Rules of Race, Barriers to an Inclusive Economy. She's also a contributor to leading periodicals such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and the Boston Review. So we'll start with some prepared remarks from Matt, followed by remarks from Felicia. Then I'll pose some questions to try to put them in conversation with each other. And finally, we'll turn to questions from our audience. And with that in mind, let me call your attention right now to the Q&A tab that should appear at the bottom of your Zoom screen or somewhere in your Zoom interface. You could submit questions there anytime during the session. I'll select questions from that list and feed them to our panelists when the time comes. Okay, with that, Matt, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Eric. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks, Felicia, for joining me today. I'm really excited about this conversation. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. It's a topic near and dear to my heart, and I think there's just a lot of interesting angles that we can explore today. So the question that Eric posed to me in inviting me to this conversation was, are markets liberated? And my answer to that is an unequivocal yes. I think that markets have both historically and in the present day been the single greatest liberating force known to humankind. So let me bear that out a little bit. I've got a few slides here that I can share with you. Bring this up. All right. So markets, in the words of Karl Marx, himself not a great fan of markets, but markets over scarce 100 years created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. We see that in what the economic historian Deirdre McCloskey called the Great Enrichment, arguably the most single important fact in human history. Oops, and now I'm advancing slides without meaning to. All right. It was markets, specialization, trade, and the technological innovations to which those processes gave rise that liberated much of humanity from centuries of uninterrupted poverty, drudgery, illiteracy, and early death. And it is markets that today are slowly but surely continuing to liberate the rest of humanity from these conditions today. By embracing markets and global trade, much of Asia has seen reductions in poverty from about 1.4 billion people in 1990 to just over 230 million people in 2015. That's an absolute difference, which, staggering in itself, nevertheless masks the even greater relative difference due to population growth over that same period. So because of markets, far fewer people are living in the desperate poverty of less than $1.90 per day. That's, of course, adjusted for purchasing power parity. And what that means for the human condition is, just another slide illustrating the same point in a somewhat different way, again, adjusting for population growth. What that means in terms of human well-being is we've got significant reductions in child mortality, significant reductions in hunger, significant reductions in literacy, even significant reductions in pollution. Not a lot of people appreciate just how vast and world-changing the reductions in global poverty have been over the last 30 years. And much of this has been due to an embrace of global markets, global trade by regions of the world that were previously closed off to them either politically or technologically. So why has this happened? What is it about markets that makes them such a powerful force for the improvement of human productivity and human well-being? That's a complicated question, and there's a lot to be said in answer to it. But for sake of simplicity, I'm going to break it down into just three different elements: incentive, information, and what I'll call, following Nassim Nicholas Taleb, anti-fragility. So starting with incentives, which I think is probably the most widely recognized and most obvious point, markets make it profitable for people to do things that make other people better off, whether that's by cleaning their house or inventing a new life-saving drugs. Markets transform human society into a vast pool of potential positive sum interactions. For most of human existence, people outside of your immediate kin group were seen, rightly so, as a threat. The emergence of trade turned those threats into allies and potential sources of human enrichment. So markets provide incentives for people to do things that make people better off, whether that's work, engage in entrepreneurial activity, trade. The incentives are an important part of what makes markets work well. But markets do more than just provide incentives. Markets also provide us with information. So imagine we didn't need the incentives, right? Imagine we just lived in a world full of angels where everybody was perfectly motivated by nothing other than a desire to maximize the common good. You'd still need markets. You'd still need a functioning price system in a society like that in order to tell people how to maximize the impartial good. Because you're going to face questions like, would I create more value as a nurse or a teacher? If I'm in the construction business, what kind of materials should I be using in my construction in order to minimize my consumption of scarce resources that other people need for maybe more pressing purposes? There's simply no way of finding that information out by looking out your window or watching the news or sending out surveys and asking for people to fill them out. The only effective way we found of aggregating this vast material of complex information that's required to answer those questions, is the price system. And this is Hayek's insight from the 1940s that in a market economy, price system serves as a mechanism for conveying information to decentralized market participants. And we haven't yet found a better substitute for that mechanism. Last element here, anti-fragility. This again comes from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and it refers to, in his idea, the capacity of a system to improve as a result of shocks, mistakes, volatility, and that kind of thing. The point isn't that markets are robust, right? That they can survive such mistakes. The point is actually that mistakes make markets better. Markets are a kind of complex, decentralized, evolutionary system, such that when a fault occurs in one part of that system, when a business fails because of a poor idea or poor implementation, the rest of the system not only survives that fault, but actually improves because it learns from that mistake. Right? The contrast here is with, say, like a fully centrally planned economy, or even a lot of government regulation within a market economy, where you have two flaws that prevent that kind of adaptive learning process. One of which is over-centralization. Right? Decisions are all being made in some centralized location rather than in a decentralized fashion. And what that means is that when something fails, it fails big, right? You get one big failure at the center rather than a smaller failure at the periphery. The other problem is the lack of a reliable feedback mechanism, such as the profit and loss mechanism that we have in markets, that tells the system when it's going wrong and how it needs to change. So markets have a kind of robustness to them. They can survive changes, but more than that, they thrive on those changes. They learn from those changes. They adapt and evolve moving forward. The mistakes are a crucial part of what makes markets work well. Two final points. Boy, I'm tearing through these slides. Eric said he was going to crack the whip and keep me on 15 minutes here, but I think he might not have a problem doing that. Two final points that I want to wrap up. They're long final points, so maybe they'll take my time. But first of all, again, the question that Eric posed to me was, are markets liberating? And the economist in me, whenever I hear a question like that, I always want to ask in response, well, compared to what, right? Are markets liberating compared to what alternative? Now, for much of the 20th century, the dominant alternative to a market economy was a socialist economy, by which was meant state ownership of the means of production and a fully centrally planned economic system. And if that's the contrast, right, if the question is, are markets liberating compared to that, then I think the debate is over and markets have won. Nobody really advocates central planning of the economy today. We've seen historically, we've seen theoretically in economics, why this is a mistake, why it's an economic disaster, why it's an economic disaster that often has a tremendous human and moral cost to go alongside with it. So that, I think, is not a relative alternative. And that leads me to conclude that really the only real debate here is not whether to have a market economy, but what kind of market economy to have. But I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that, right? So to say that we ought to embrace a market economy is not the same thing as saying that we ought to embrace 19th century laissez-faire Spencerian capitalism, right? The United States is, I think, a market economy, but it is a market economy that has substantial levels of regulation and redistribution. Some of that stuff is good. Some of that stuff is not so good, but it's certainly not by any stretch of the imagination a system of laissez-faire. So what about Denmark, right? What about Sweden? Aren't those socialist countries? Aren't those a viable alternative to the market economy? That's a question I hear a lot, but it's based, I think, on a deep misperception. Sweden and Denmark are not socialist economies, not at least in the sense of being societies that have done away with the market economy. They are market economies. They are market economies with very robust forms of redistribution and a very generous social safety net, but they are market economies nonetheless. They are, in fact, on some measures, even better market economies than the United States. So here's a little graph I picked up from a source called the Economic Freedom of the World, which is created by researchers who are pretty partial to economic freedom and markets. And even on their measure, the United States is not the freest economy in the world. Sweden and Denmark are both freer in terms of various measures, including respect for property right, ease of global trade, and so forth. Denmark significantly so. I don't think that those work as viable methods, viable alternatives to the market economy. Denmark and Sweden, the Scandinavian model is just the market economy with a lot of redistribution thrown on top. And although I describe myself as a libertarian, I actually find that model pretty attractive in a lot of respects. So there might be less disagreement between Felicia and I than one might be led to believe from my self-description as a libertarian and her self-description as someone on the progressive left. I think we both probably, I'm anticipating here, but I think we both probably think that some kind of market economy is desirable, but also that some kinds of government intervention ought to supplement, regulate, shape that market economy. And I think the action is going to be in what we think that regulation and redistribution ought to look like. So for instance, for my own part, and we can talk, I expect we'll talk much more about this in the Q&A, but for my own part, I think that redistribution is, generally speaking, much less problematic than regulation. And that's one of the things that the Scandinavian economies do well. I think that redistribution, for instance, requires much less informational capacity on the part of government than regulation. It's easy to give people money or access to vital goods and services. It's a lot harder to tell a coal plant how it should be run, right? That kind of regulation involves a lot of local and dispersed knowledge that's very difficult for government agents to come by. I also think that regulation, when we have it, and I do, of course, think some regulation is necessary, ought to be, generally speaking, as simple as possible and to mimic some of the virtues of the market system when it's possible. So, right, if we're talking about environmental regulation, I would lean in favor of something like a system of tradable emissions credits, right, rather than a command and control system of regulation that specifies the use of certain technologies to reduce pollution, or that specifies certain fixed levels of output for each individual firm. So I think there are some important differences there to explore between my worldview and Felicia's. But again, I think there's a lot of overlap. I think that's not by accident. The market economy is the system that we've got today. There's no alternative to the market economy, and it's a good thing too. So with that, I'll turn it over to Felicia. And I'm going to be, we had a PowerPoint issue, so I'm going to be running Felicia's slides first. So she's going to let me know when she wants me to change things, and I'll.
And let me just chime in to remind the audience, at any time you can drop your questions into the Q&A pane. Please do so whenever a speaker says something you want to respond to or ask about. You can drop your question in there while it's on your mind, and we'll read those out later. And again, as Matt said, because COMPAS is about bringing people together, Matt is going to be advancing Felicia's slides for her. So Felicia, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, we're completely modeling civic cooperation here, Matt.
I do expect to be paid
Matt
for my services, though.
Of course you do. We should ask OSU about that. Anyway, it's very nice to be here with you this afternoon, Matt. Thanks for both this conversation. Of course, Eric, also thank you. And thanks again for being a great partner. Perhaps we're on different sides of the aisle, I'm not sure, but at any rate, I really appreciate you helping me out with the PowerPoint jam. So yes, the question, are markets liberating? Matt's right. I think that both of us ask a series of questions around the degree to which you need, I would say, he names regulation and redistribution. I would also name something that economists and political economists have begun to call pre-distribution, which is, to what degree do you need to begin to structure a market so that the results that it actually produces are more equitable and more universal. So that's another kind of term I'll throw out there. But anyway, next slide. Thank you. So what I really wanted to say is, so I think it's really important, as Matt did, to bring in some empirics and some history to this conversation, because for me, the question is not only are markets liberating, but for whom are markets liberating and under what conditions. And I'm going to focus most of my talk here on the period in the mid to late 20th century up to the present. So you can say it's 1980 to the present, you could say it's 1950 to the present, but I think the question in this period, not only in the United States, but in world history, this is an era that many people have called the era of neoliberalism, which we don't have to completely define that multisyllabic word, but to the degree to which we are in a period of, I would say, market fundamentalism, what have really been the empirical outcomes from that period. So next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I will just say that the period that we have been talking about that I'm talking about here, between 1980 and the present, is really an era in which you have a kind of market fundamentalism that is not just economic and not just intellectual, but it's also social, in that you have many churches and other kinds of schools and other kinds of institutions that carry this belief that markets and market values ought to come first. It is political in that most of our powerful political figures, I would submit, both Republican and Democratic. Up until 2016, most of our major political figures, at least in the United States, have had a kind of neoliberal consensus, a market forward consensus. And then, of course, there are a lot of policy ideas that have come along with neoliberalism, including the idea that it is best to have small government, it is best to have low taxes, and it is best to have as little regulation as possible. And it's also best to have as little union representation as possible. So that, in a nutshell, is those are some of the ideas behind neoliberalism. My real point here is that the kind of market fundamentalism that you saw in neoliberalism and that most probably Americans think of as being ushered in by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, it is not just an economic set of ideas, right? It's a social and political set of ideas as well. And I think that's very important. Next slide, please. So, but I want to get to the empirics. So markets, this very hyper market focus from the 1980s to the present, to 2016, I would say, this market focus really promised growth, and it also promised mobility. And so we have to ask how it did. On its own terms, did it actually bring the kind of growth and mobility that it promised? And I would submit just a few things, which is that first, you've actually seen growth in the United States, GDP growth slow since 1980. It has become more stable over time, but it has slowed about a point. Between 1945 and 1980, you had growth at about a point higher than you have seen from 1980 to the present. Another outcome that you've seen since about 1980 is that the income share of the top 1% has doubled. You see more and more income going to the top. This is what people talk about a lot with respect to the rise of inequality over the last 40 or 50 years. Another way of looking at this is that the median income has actually slowed and it has stagnated against productivity. There's a very famous graph that I didn't include here, but it's basically the alligator jaws. You see productivity rising, but you see income remaining fairly static. Median income has basically been almost flat in real terms since 2000. It's been interesting to look at some of these numbers since the pandemic, but regardless, I think the trend is pretty telling. And then finally, this is just another way of saying it's a version of the same thing, but Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, the economists who have done a lot of work in this area, have basically concluded that at first, when you saw the growth of top incomes, it was a labor income phenomenon, meaning like people were being paid more for their labor, not more for being wealthy. But in fact, since about 2000, more and more top incomes have basically been capital income. It's why you see this conversation, even this last week, around should we be instituting a wealth tax, some kind of wealth tax to pay for a lot of the infrastructure and social insurance bills that have been somewhat moving through our nation's capital. At any rate, next slide, please. This is an international phenomenon, right? And so the IMF a few years ago did a study, 150 plus country study, 1960 to the present. Were you going to see better growth and better redistribution under a kind of market fundamentalist system? And actually, you have not seen that. What you've seen is that lower net inequality lower inequality has led to more growth, faster growth, and more durable growth. And you've also seen that the redistribution has not hurt growth. There's a famous economic argument which says that there's a trade-off essentially between growth and distribution. And basically what the IMF found, looking at this multi-country study over a very long period of time, is that that trade-off is certainly not as sharp as the original theory would have predicted it to be. So next slide, please. So this is something that we've all been very familiar with. My colleague Mike Conzel actually calculated this. This is from about 2000 to the present, but basically you've seen household incomes flat and corporate profits really rise over the last 20 plus years. Next slide, please. And then one of the really important things that I wanted to point out here is that wealth has been quite racialized in the United States. These are numbers that I think many of us are now quite familiar with, but basically you see that Black households, Black American households, and Latinx households basically hold almost no wealth, right? 6,000. That includes like the value of your home, the value of your car, the value of any other assets that you might have. And so those numbers pretty consistently from 1980 through, this only goes through 2014, but the numbers are actually worsening now, are pretty much hold steady around $5,000, $10,000. By the way, if it's a single-headed household, those numbers are often net negative or very close to zero. And white households, you see wealth at anywhere between 100. By the early 2000s, it goes to about $160,000. It's now closer to about $125,000. But the larger point is that wealth is quite racialized. So then I think you have to ask yourself, next slide, please, sorry. Why are some of our markets not liberating? And I think that, oh, I know why you thought I had a lot of slides. I think I sent you an earlier version, Matt, but this will basically be, this will be my last slide. I'm sorry, the rest of these are from an old presentation. But anyway, you have to ask yourself, okay, why are some of our markets not liberating? Why are markets not liberating in the ways that we might have hoped, right? And some of the libertarians, Hayek and others in the mid-20th century might have hoped. Why have we seen these very unequal outcomes? And I would posit just 3 hypotheses. The first is that, they're not really free. These aren't really free markets. These are markets that have been really dominated, especially since the 1980s, by financialization, enabled by deregulation, I would submit. These are markets that are increasingly dominated by large firms. These large firms increasingly make money by making money. They make money by holding money. And so you just see, a very sclerotic and also a very financialized system rather than the kind of idealized market system that you can imagine with, lots of producers and lots of buyers and sellers, all sort of small or medium size. So that's one hypothesis as to why our markets why we haven't seen the results that we would have wanted. The second hypothesis is actually that our definition of freedom is wrong, right? That one of the problems is that we have thought about economic freedom as being the freedom to hold private property and the freedom to contract within sort of legally constrained or legally within a legally defined system of market transaction. But actually, that is not the only way to think about freedom. And oftentimes when you think about freedom in that way, what you are missing is other kinds of freedom that could be more solidaristic, that could be more social. And it also misses the idea that much of what markets are actually producing is actually bad, right? The classic example, of course, is climate change. Much of what the market left to its own accord right now would produce is pollution and carbon that is killing us, that is creating the kind of climate change crisis that scientists are, frankly, that's already here. So I think both the second hypothesis is that both the definition of freedom is wrong, and that part of the hyper focus on private property and contract means that all of these other things that markets produce that are bad are being incentivized. And then the third thing that I'd like to propose here is that, markets are not liberating for people who have systematically by almost any measure, been purposely excluded from labor market participation and from wealth accumulation. So there are essentially centuries of race and gender stratification. Of course, the enslavement of African Americans, of Black Americans, is only one example. Jim Crow is only one example. The Chinese Exclusion Act is only one example. The fact that women couldn't get any number of jobs in this country is yet another example. But there are so many examples of rules, and then of course social norms that have stratified the kind of market economy, the kind of capitalism that we've lived in, means that you really can't start from a libertarian ideal if what you would like to do in real life right now is get to more equal and more just and frankly more thriving and higher growth outcomes. You actually have to start somewhere different. I think it would be a really interesting question, and I know I'm at time, it'd be a really interesting question for both of us to think about, for me and Matt and others in the audience to consider. Well, if you could abstract from this historical set of phenomena, the historical reality of race and gender stratification, then might a sort of more market fundamentalist set of ideas be the right way to organize our society? That's a pretty interesting set of questions, but that is not the reality that we currently live in. And so therefore I would submit that we need, and we can talk about it in the Q&A, a whole bunch of other tools, even beyond redistribution and beyond, well, certainly beyond redistribution, to get to the kind of both thriving and green and more equal market system that I think Matt and I would both like to live in.
Thank you both. Matt, I think we can stop sharing the screen now and turn to the conversation part of our conversation. Those are really generative comments. Thank you all. We have a rich set of questions coming in from the audience. Keep those coming, please. And I think there's enough of them that I'm only going to ask one question myself, which is just to take up the issue that Matt posed at the end of his talk. You've both said that markets are important and valuable and have a kind of, I think, fundamental role to play in an open society. You've also both said that markets need to be regulated and set up in ways that they actually do achieve the ends that their proponents claim they ought to achieve. And so I'm curious to know whether you each see the differences between yourselves as differences of like emphasis or degree, or whether there's some more fundamental issue of principle that you think you disagree upon, and if so, what that principle might be. I mean, Matt, do you think it's correct to characterize the last 40 years as an era of market fundamentalism? And do you agree with Felicia's characterization of what's gone wrong during that period? Felicia, do you look at the kind of market ideal that Matt sketches and the kind of historical arc of what markets have done in the world and see something that you find attractive that you'd like to work maybe with people like him to try to realize? So again, do you really disagree when it comes to the end of the day? And if so, what is it you disagree about, or is it just a matter of emphasis? Felicia, why don't you go first?
I think we might disagree, actually, civilly and interestingly, but I think we might disagree. For the following reason, I actually think there is a very significant, very affirmative, very direct role for government in actually in structuring markets. Certainly, antitrust laws are one good example. You know, should large tech companies be broken up? Should we care that, you know, there are only a handful of certain kinds of manufacturers in certain sectors of our economy? So I think that there's a direct role for government in structuring markets. But I would go even further than that. I actually think there's a direct role for government in providing certain goods that we absolutely know that the market will not provide uniformly, or not even uniformly, but certainly universally. Healthcare is one, right? Healthcare is a very obvious one that we've been fighting about in this country for maybe 100 years, certainly for 20 years. But there are many, many other goods and services, childcare is another, that the market just won't provide adequately. And frankly, we can afford to provide. And so it ought to be up to government to find ways to both to directly provide those things and also, I would say, to incentivize incentivize the private sector to provide more and to provide more universally.
Matt, you're muted. There you go.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much disagreement there is, and I think we'd have to dig into the weeds a little bit to explore. But for instance, I agree with a lot of the spirit actually of what Felicia just said. I do think that there are things that markets do really, really well, and there are things that markets don't do very well. So markets are notoriously bad at dealing with the problem of large-scale externalities. As of the sort involved with climate change. So that's clearly a case where you cannot rely on markets to get things done. You need some kind of government regulation. And I think, I've written a couple of papers on why I think this is something that libertarians should be much more concerned about. If you take individual sovereignty and property rights seriously, then the fact that your actions are creating these spillover effects into other people's bodies and other people's properties is something that as a libertarian, you ought to be very concerned about. So I agree with the fact that there are things that governments ought to do to step in where markets don't do well. You did say there are services that government ought to directly provide, like healthcare and childcare, and I'm not sure how literally to take you on the term directly provide. Like I don't think you mean like government-run childcare centers, which I think would probably be a bad idea. But I think government paying people. Giving people money that they could use to buy childcare services on the private sector, that I think might be something that's justifiable, and a little bit more decentralized, a little bit more friendlier to my kind of market-based approach. So we could explore those issues on the market fundamentalism thing. I think I do have a disagreement, right? I think there are people maybe who could be accurately described as market fundamentalists. But I think I disagree with the claim that was the governing ethos of the last 40 years or what have you. I think the United States is a complex economy, and the people who are in charge of running that economy don't have any sort of consistent ideology. The system of regulations that emerge from the cesspool of politics is something that doesn't really have any sort of strong ideological thread running through it. It's a product of compromise, log rolling, and lots of other competing interests. So so we could look at what's happened over those 40 years, right? And there has been a slowdown in growth. There has been an increase in inequality. And then for me, I think the question is, why is that happening? Is it something that can be attributed to the market elements of the system that we have, right? Or is it something that's attributable to other non-market elements of the system that we have? Because it's a mixed system. There's a book that I really like a lot by Brink Lindsay and Stephen Tellis called The Captured Economy, which looks at this phenomenon of rising inequality and slowing growth and traces it to this mix of sort of powerful financial interests and powerful government sort of working together to advance their own interests at the expense of the common good. And you see this in housing regulation, which is not a sort of driven by market fundamentalist principles. You see this in the financial sector. You see this in intellectual property law. You see this in sort of pervasive occupational licensing. These are all phenomena that involve a mix of kind of markets and government regulation, but a sort of perverse form of government regulation that doesn't seem to be doing a good job of making the masses of society any better off.
Yeah, just two quick responses to that. Yeah, I agree with Brink and Steve in some respects and disagree with him in other respects. I think that they underestimate the power that the private sector sort of unleashed, the unleashed private sector, which has seen lobbying just skyrocket and corporate profits similarly just skyrocket over the past 40 years. I think they underestimate that as a force. And I also think that they, therefore, some of the solutions that they suggest, which are things like, to get rid of things like occupational licensing, which they see as a problem on the government side, are just, they're insufficient to the problems that we really face right now. But more fundamentally, I think, you know, you asked a question about, do I think that government should be directly providing some goods and services? And I actually think the answer is yes. I do think government should be. Childcare is a great example. I think that, and some of the debate that we have been having for the last 10 years around childcare, 10 years or longer around childcare. The problem with a subsidies approach in the current system, which is quite broken, is that if you just had subsidies, you would I'm not sure that there would be enough of a price mechanism to incentivize high quality. There's a supply side problem too, right? So if you just had subsidies, you could end up with much higher prices for a still very limited number of childcare slots, because the childcare market is completely broken. You have relatively low supply, and you still have, for some people, relatively high prices. So I think in that case, I would actually submit that, and there's a whole bunch of other political reasons that it's very hard to get here, but I would submit that the direct provision of childcare, you know, at least some point in one of the early Biden proposals, there's $25 billion to actually have public childcare centers. And you have a proposal right now for public pre-K, which would be obviously very similar to the public K-12 system. So I think it would actually be more equitable and more just, and you'd probably have, you might then have better private provision also, but you should see more direct government provision of things like childcare. I don't think it should be exclusive, but I think you should have that as a way to essentially crowd in better private childcare as well. So yes, I would say direct provision is something that I would argue for.
We could spend an hour on that topic, I'm sure. Matt, there was a question inviting you to take up Felicia's comment about pre-distribution, whether that's something that you would favor, or maybe you want to hear more about from your own sort of market, pro-market standpoint.
Yeah, it's a term that I'm familiar with, but it's also a term I've seen used in a lot of very different ways. And so I might be open to it in some interpretations, and I'd love to hear more about what Felicia had in mind, if she'd care to elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, I use the term sort of broadly and sort of deliberately broadly. I think the problem with a focus just on regulation and redistribution suggests that you're going to accept all kinds of unequal outcomes as a result of the labor markets, and then use the tax system to redistribute. And I think that we can do better than that. I actually think that we can develop a system whereby the labor market actually regularly produces better jobs for more people. You're still going to need a redistributive system after that. But we are so far from that now that I would just suggest that there are ways to structure all kinds of markets so that wages are higher. You've already seen this. Since it's been fascinating to watch what's happened to the economy over the last 18 months, when you've had a pretty significant amount of government intervention to basically forestall the worst of what could have been a disastrous recession. It's been bad for a lot of people, but it would have been much worse had you not seen the CARES Act and the rescue plan. So anyway, all I would say is that that I do think we can build a system that has better outcomes in the labor market itself. So there, you and I might agree. And then after that, I'd also like to, let's see what kind of redistribution we need after that.
Yeah, so I think that's something that I'm open to as a general principle, right? And then the devil's in the details, right, with regard to particular ways of structuring the labor market or other markets. But I think one of the points that's sort of implicit in your what you've said there is, I think, a valid point against what I might call a kind of naive libertarian, which is just that there are these sort of natural phenomena called markets, right? That exist in this pristine form, and then the government comes along and it can tinker with them in various ways. And I think that's a mistaken way of thinking about markets, right? And if you spend some time with lawyers, or you go to law school, right, and you learn very quickly about the myriad and complex ways in which the law structures and creates markets. I don't go the whole kind of Nagel-Murphy route of saying, right, there's no such thing as markets or property independent of government, but I think you can deny that very strong philosophical claim and nevertheless recognize that legal systems inevitably play a very strong role in specifying and determining the kind of markets that's going to exist in a society. And once you've granted that point, then I think you've got to address the question of what are the better and worse ways of doing that structure. And so if that's pre-distribution, then I'm all in favor of pre-distribution, alongside my sort of general libertarian inclination to let markets do what they do well, which is efficiently allocate resources. And then if you don't like the resulting distribution, kind of use the redistributive tool to kind of shuffle things around, but try not to interfere with the efficient allocation of resources that markets do well in the process of creating that more just outcome. So those are my two sort of general.
I mean, there's a lot to say about that, and I'm sure there are lots of questions here, but the one thing I would just say, I think we just have to come back to this point. Markets really have not done well for a whole group of people and a whole group of groups of people in this country. And that's been actually, you're absolutely right that markets are structured as to who's in, who's out. The numbers of people who couldn't get jobs, who couldn't rise in the jobs that they did get, and instead were stuck in either unpaid labor or extraordinarily low paid labor or very insecure labor, it has been so highly racialized and gendered that I think that we have to, so on the one hand, I would agree with you. Yes, markets do structure participation, but also one of the reasons I think it's important to think about pre-distribution, especially for Black Americans, Latinx Americans, Indigenous, there's a whole group of people who have been so left out that I think finding ways to structure the markets, to strengthen the markets that they tend to be in, home care and childcare is one example, is like a really important thing to do as we think about how to actually structure our market so they're both more equitable and more productive.
This may be a nice knock on to how markets are structured. Somebody's invited us to reflect on how we think about integrated supply chains as kind of a phenomenon in the global economy today, which sort of effectively internalize a lot of the information that markets are supposed to be providing along the lines that Matt was suggesting. So are supply chains a kind of threat to a market order as you imagine it? Are they a positive development and evolution of that order, or what? What do you think about supply chains?
I'm happy to take that, or Matt, do you have a way to address the question?
I don't know that I have an immediate response to it. I think, one of the things that COVID did for me was create a newfound appreciation for all those kids who went to business school and studied supply chain management, and made it so that most of the time when I go to Costco, there is enough toilet paper and Kleenex there, right? Like you don't know what you've got until it's gone. So I'm generally pretty enthusiastic about the sort of complex web of supply chains that make up a market economy. But maybe you were asking sort of about question. Maybe the question was more directed at sort of kind of sweatshop labor type questions where farther back in the supply chain there are ethically problematic behaviors. I'm not sure.
I mean, the way I would think about, I actually think that you always have supply chains, right? You can have a supply chain, like one farmer, one purchaser or something like that. But I think if I'm assuming properly, I think what the questioner was asking was, what do we think about the very, very, very thin and brittle supply chains that have been sort of revealed to be so problematic during the course of COVID, and of course that supply chain problem, the question of how thin international supply chains sort of put us at risk, both with respect to national security and with respect to sort of economics, is something that COVID revealed, but this has been worsening since actually the late 1980s and since the sort of vaunted Washington consensus. And so just one example that people have been talking about a lot that I think is really important to think about is, for example, the semiconductor shortage in the United States, the very thin semiconductor supply chain. This is a case in which basically you have over 50% of all semiconductors and even higher percentage of semiconductors that are needed for very high-end vehicles like electric cars, et cetera, being produced in Taiwan. And so the problem with that is that it's essentially, it's a kind of, I wouldn't call it quite a monopoly, but it's certainly an extraordinarily concentrated market that then is not particularly robust and is easily interrupted, whether it's by COVID or obviously political unrest with China. So this is so the question then is, do you need to restructure a market, that market in particular, to create a more robust and perhaps domestic or G7 focused set of supply chain manufacturers? And that's actually a really big question right now. I don't have a great answer for it, but what's really interesting is that so the Biden administration has set aside, not just in semiconductors, but in a lot of other critical industries, tens of billions of dollars to try to restart or create a kind of industrial policy in the United States to try to reshore manufacturing here. That's a very interesting way to think about structuring markets. I have a lot of both hope and concerns for what that might look like. But I'm pretty excited actually about the idea that you might need that kind of government as setting a North Star for what the sectors in an economy ought to be, as a way to think about creating more robust and less thin supply chains.
This might be a nice knock on to that as well. We had a provocative question making the observation, aren't all societies a combination of markets and central planning? If so, what's the optimal balance? And might we say that China has reached a better balance than the United States in the sense of balancing the idea of lifting more people out of poverty and using markets to kind of rapidly create wealth for its people? Our theme this year is markets in the open society. China, by most definitions, is not an open society, but it is by some definitions kind of a market society. So the question is the mix that China's arrived at between command and open economy the right mix or what standards do we use to kind of think about what the right mix might be? Maybe Matt should start.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's so with respect to the first part of the question. Yeah, I think all societies are a mix of sort of decentralized and centralized planning, right? So, I mean, this is a point that Hayek himself made in the famous 1945 article, right? I mean, you've got a market society, which is generally speaking a system of decentralized economic planning, but within that decentralized system, you have firms, right? And firms are little bastions of central planning within the market economy. You have families that are bastions of central planning within the market economy, and other, organizations that span in the midst of civil society between the family and the firm. So, so I think that's right. I think when you're talking about government regulation, you're engaged in a bit of sort of miniature central planning there, right? Like you're structuring various markets. You're coming up with a plan for the economy as a whole as to how these markets could be structured. And I think in some cases that's appropriate, in some cases not, right? So what Hayek and I think others were objecting to in central planning was sort of full-scale central planning of the economy, the abolition of the price system, the abolition of private property. But I think a lot of that argument, it cuts not just against the sort of extreme form of central planning, but also against more robust, more ambitious forms of regulation within a market economy, right? So it's kind of a continuum. The more presumption of knowledge there is in the regulations that are to be undertaken, the more nervous a Hayekian like myself is going to get about that kind of regulation. I think there's simply a lot that regulators don't know. It's hard to predict the outcome of various forms of regulation. We endorse a regulation with one sort of outcome in mind. It creates unintended effects. We create different regulations to deal with those unintended effects, and you get this kind of vicious cycle of regulation feeding upon itself. So I think there's a worrisome problem there, but it's one of these problems that needs to be dealt with in the particulars of the concrete case, right? I have a sort of general libertarian worry whenever regulation gets ambitious, but that's not to say that it's never unjustifiable. In terms of China, it's true that China has lifted a lot of people out of poverty over the last 30 years, but that's largely because there were an awful lot of people living in desperate poverty 30 years ago. And so whenever you're lagging behind another society in some measure like poverty reduction or industrialization, there's often a kind of catch-up period where you can make rapid gains pretty easily. We saw this with the Soviet Union in the middle of the 20th century, where it looked for a while like the Soviet Union was going to bury us economically, because under Stalin, they were industrializing at an incredibly rapid pace, but that was partly because they started off from a largely agrarian society that had no industrialization. So I wouldn't take that fact as any kind of indication that China has a better mix of things right now. I think I'd certainly rather live in the United States than China. I think the economic system in the United States is better. And I think that, not coincidentally, the political system and the status of human liberties is significantly better in the United States, which again is not a call for apathy or complacence. We do have quite a few problems at home too.
Just one quick thing on China. I know we're probably almost at time. I would just note that China has as a result of the kind of growth it's seen over the last several decades, it now has a massive inequality problem too, which Xi Jinping has turned, the government's attention toward very assiduously. It'll be interesting to see how quickly and effectively the Chinese are able to try to get their inequality problem under some. Are they able to reverse any of those trends? But it's pretty interesting.
We are almost at time. We unfortunately have some questions on the table here. It's with regret that I have to call this session to a close. It's been a very rich conversation. Thank you both so much for your contributions, for your charity toward each other, and for your receptivity to the questions our audience is throwing at you. Please join us. Visit cehv.compass.osu.edu. Let me try that again, cehv.osu.edu/compass, to see our upcoming Compass events. We hope to see you at many of those, some of which will actually be in person. Until then, thanks so much for joining us today. Please join me in virtually thanking our guests, and please enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Great to speak with you both.
Yeah, that was great. That was a lot of fun. A lot of issues that we didn't get to that
Indeed.
to talk about too. But
lots more to talk about. Yep. Okay.
As always.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.